Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Today, we have a director, illustrator, beekeeper, filmmaker. He's a writer, a family man, and a famed photographer. He's recognized for his iconic celebrity portraits and scientific photography. He has shot the likes of Bono, Barack Obama, the Dalia Lama, Leonardo DiCaprio, Johnny Depp, and many, many others. He's won over 100 national and international awards that includes the World Press Photo Award, a professional photographer for over 35 years, a Ventura County, California native, and photo historian. Please welcome to the show, Dan Winters. Dan, welcome to Before the Lights.
Thanks. Good to be here.
What is your first memory of photography?
First memory of photography that's really salient for me probably was we had a 1964 Volkswagen bus, and my mom kept the camera in the glove box of the camera of the bus. And I went in there one time and I shot an entire roll of myself. So I did like a roll of selfies, and kind of my mom, the way she tells it, she says that I denied doing it, which I can't imagine I was that stupid at, 9 or 8. But that's kind of my first like burnt in memory. But I think my first memory to where I kind of realized that it was an art form and could potentially be a pursuit was we had a local friend who had been a Navy photographer during the Vietnam War, and he had a darkroom at his house, and I was good friends with his son. And I remember him inviting me and his son into the darkroom one afternoon when he was printing. And so seeing the process and seeing the print come up in the developer, it just seemed like such a magic moment in this alchemy of kind of like light and dark. And I think that was the most sort of burned in first impression of photography that I have.
Speaking of the darkroom, I've spoken with friends of mine and other people I've interviewed. What is it about the darkroom with the photographer? They say it's magic and it brings back these smells and things. Is the darkroom like this magical place for photographers?
I think, I know a lot of photographers that hate the darkroom as well. So I think it depends on your disposition a little bit, but it's definitely a quiet place. And it's a place for experimentation and contemplation and patience. And certainly, every time you step in there, the smell they're talking about is glacial acetic acid. It's used for stopping the rapid development of the print. And it's a really unique vinegary smell. And just like every darkroom has that smell. And it definitely is a sense memory that comes up. I mean, that sense memory for me it takes me all the way back to that first exposure as a kid that I spoke about. But the darkroom is, it can be a really magical place. And I think the other thing about the darkroom was that in black and white, and I'm speaking only about black and white because color darkroom is a very different experience. The black and white darkroom, you can really sort of realize what your image is because there are so many ways to interpret it. Ansel Adams likened the negative to the score and the print to the performance, because the score could be interpreted a lot of different ways. It could be arranged differently. And printing is a very similar thing. There are a lot of different, there are bad prints, but there are certainly a wide range of ways to interpret an image, and they can all present sort of a different emotional spectrum. There was a great show at LA County Museum years back of Ansel Adams, and there was one of his blue chip images was called Moonrise over Hernandez, New Mexico. And there were probably like 10 or 12 iterations of that individual image on one wall. And it spanned his entire career from the 40s until the last interpretation of it. And it was such a vastly different image. It got darker, it got more dramatic as time went on. And you really could see as a viewer, like what the possibilities of the darkroom were. So it is a magical place. But I do think it's not for everybody. I mean, there are guys that they're, very famous professional photographers that didn't want to step near it. They had lab techs They had people that printed for them. They didn't go there. But I think for some people that really kind of are on a quest, it is a really magical place.
Do you remember what your first camera was?
Yeah. Well, the first camera I got was, I kind of came to photography a little bit more through film, because my friends and I would make these movies, these like army movies and sort of like spy movies and stuff. And we would use the first camera I got that was actually my camera, which I still have actually, was a Kodak Brownie 8mm movie camera, not a Super 8, but a dual 8. It preceded Super 8. And I got it from my granddad. And I think one of the reasons that I got more interested in photography as time went on is the disappointment of waiting for a week or two to get the film back and having it be like underexposed or overexposed, and not really having a technical sense of how to deal with the materials. And so as time went on and I got more serious about making movies, I got a light meter and I learned how to meter, and my disappointment diminished quite a bit when I would get the film back. But I also simultaneously kind of started gradually gravitating towards doing still photography. I mean, I still do film stuff, and we just finished a short film actually not too long ago. But I think that was kind of the moment for me.
In 1979 in high school, you were working full-time in the motion picture special effects industry in a miniature construction and design. How did you balance full-time working in the motion picture industry and going to school?
So at my school, I went to Moore Park High School in Ventura County, and we had a program for seniors that had completed all their compulsory credits, and it was called Work Experience. And so I would go first period and second period, and then immediately after second period, I would drive down to the model shop where I was working and work till about 8 o'clock at night, and then turn around, go back and do it the next day. It was kind of a pass-fail thing. It was just like you could have a job if you'd already completed all your classes. And I wanted to work in model building really, really, really badly. I started pestering what was at the time ILM, Industrial Light and Magic. I started pestering them and sending them photographs of my models that I would scratch build. I'd scratch build spaceship models and things that were inspired by Star Wars in 2001 and Alien. Well, at that time, that was pre-Alien. But, I'd take pictures of them, which is where the still photography kind of really started to burgeon, and send them down there. And eventually I landed a model building job, not at ILM because they moved up to Marin County, but with another model shop that some of the model builders that were at ILM brought me on board.
You began your career in photography as a photojournalist in Thousand Oaks, California at the News Chronicle. What did your days as a newspaper photographer teach you that you've taken with you throughout your career?
So, I was talking to my son yesterday about what was the best. He asked me what the best time in my life was, because he's 27 now and he's trying to figure out, I think, like, did I already miss the best time of my life or is it coming? And I said, I have a whole bunch of those and they're incremental. And, the newspaper job was certainly one of those best times of my life. But it was, it's a progression. If you ask me what's the best time of my life, I'd probably say I'm totally happy with where I am right now. But the thing about the Chronicle was it was very romantic. I lived in a trailer. I had a 62 Volkswagen Bug. I had my vest, my photojournalist vest, my scanner, my police and fire scanner, my cameras around my neck. And it was like this amazing thing. I'd show up for work, go to my mailbox, pull out my assignment sheets, see what I had to do that day, listen to the scanner all day, if I had a darkroom day or whatever it was. And I think the thing I learned the most from the Chronicle, and it's something I speak to students about quite a bit, is the process of showing up for an assignment and getting to the point where you're actually photographing. because that's one thing I don't think you can really teach. It has to do with people's skills at interaction with other people and putting people at ease, your own comfort level with your abilities, those things. But I learned, because I was doing 2 to 3 assignments a day, how to get in, how to get the picture, and how to get out. And the other thing I realized at the Chronicle early on was I knew I wanted to be a magazine photographer. I loved being a photojournalist. Don't get me wrong. It was incredible. It was exhilarating. I felt like I was a part of a family. The paper I was at was doing really, really well with contests and winning awards for photography. And so we had a really great, tight-knit photo staff. But what I realized is, like, every single assignment was an opportunity to experiment, to push my technical abilities, to push my abilities with regards to, how I wanted to sort of present the subject, making decisions about presentation. And those were all skills that I honed there, that I've taken all the way through my career. Those are consistent with regardless of what we're shooting. Those are, making those decisions, having conviction, establishing intent. What's my intention for the day with this individual shot? Because I think when you establish a intent, kind of everything kind of falls in behind that. So I think the newspaper experience was phenomenal, and it was, like I said, it was like this. It was very like the Rockford Files. I was like living in a trailer and very sort of loosey-goosey, kind of. It was just a really romantic kind of job.
Now you got me walking to go watch the Rockford Files again. As soon as you said that, bringing back some memories there. Mm-hmm. When I say the name Irving Penn, what comes to mind?
The man. He was always a hero of mine. The thing I loved about Penn was that he was able to interpret a really broad range of subject matter. He wasn't sort of like a one-trick pony. He had a lot of different ways of working, and he was a technical master, and he was able to create portraits that you really felt like he was able to extract something special from his subjects. And he was always a great hero of mine. It was always that joke about, like, in the photography world about, Penn or Avedon kind of thing, like, who do you like? And of course I love Avedon as well, but Penn was always kind of the guy that I was most excited about in regards to, like, the publishing world.
In some of the research that I did for this interview, you've been compared to Irving Penn. How does that make you feel?
It's funny. The National Portrait Gallery had a big Irving Penn show, and they asked me if I would speak on the opening night. And for me, it was like I almost couldn't believe that they were asking me to do that. It was such a great honor for me, as Penn was like I said, such a hero of mine. And then being sort of like asked to participate in that capacity was kind of incredible. And then, I saw that the podcast that one individual posted about it, and I was really flattered and honored that, people would make that connection, to be honest. Not entirely surprised, because if there is a career that I modeled my own on, I would say, with the exception of, like, Penn did a lot of fashion stuff for Vogue because he was a Condé Nast contract photographer. I don't do a lot of fashion work, but I would say Penn would have been the one that I would have admired and maybe modeled my sort of working method after. I don't think my work looks like his. There's crossover sometimes, but I think I think to your point, to your question, yeah, incredibly honored for people to even draw that correlation.
In 2000, you moved to Austin, Texas. You have your studio in a historic building that was built in 1903 and was a general store, a gas station, and a post office. When you take over this building, Dan, was there anything left over from way back then that you were able to keep, or was it just completely emptied?
The building was empty. It's funny, it's in a small community about 22 miles outside Austin. And the post office boxes are in the garage of one of the guys that lives up the street, who's an old timer. the potbelly stove that used to be in here is in someone else's garage. So those pieces are around. I couldn't really put them in here because I need the space. The one thing I would say that remains from the time gone by is the old gravity gas pump. It was put in the 30s, and it's still out front. And I knew the actual owner of this. He ran the gentleman that ran the general store. He ran it for 40 years, I think. His name was Hudson Dildy. He passed away in 2003, but he kind of told me the whole history of the place as far as he knew it. And they had replaced the gas pump with more modern pumps in the 50s, but he liked the way that pump looked, so he didn't have them take it out. And so it still stands. It's kind of the sentinel that stands before the building to this day.
That's pretty cool. That is really cool. And it's cool that you're in a building that has such historic history to it as well. How did you get into celebrity portraits?
So once again, early on when I was at the News Chronicle, I really enjoyed doing portrait assignments. And a lot of the guys, or several of the guys there, didn't really like doing portraits. They liked doing sports and spot news. So I would trade sports assignments for portrait assignments with them because I really enjoyed doing portraits, and I started taking lights with me and experimenting with lighting. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I love the interaction with people. And when I moved to New York, and I worked with a photographer, Chris Callis, for a year. And right at a year, I left and went on my own. But during that time, I had looked at a lot of magazines. I'd go to magazine stands and sort of scour the racks and kind of figure out where my work or where my idea of my work could live. And I realized that there was always a need for portraits. Every magazine I looked at, current portraits of people, regardless of what they had. And I was like really, and still am really into music. So I'd look at music magazines and arts and culture magazines. And so I tried to fill a portfolio up in that year period of time when I was with Chris. I tried to fill a portfolio up with portraits. And what I did in that time was I basically photographed friends, people I'd met socially. I'd say, hey, can I do a portrait of you? Bring them to my little studio, and I'd set up lights and shoot it. And that's what my initial portfolio was when I went out and started dropping off at magazines. I didn't have anyone of note really in my portfolio. It was just a way to show that I could shoot portraits in hopes that I could get portrait assignments. And sure enough, right off the bat, I started getting portrait assignments. It works in an interesting way. Publicists have a lot of power. And in that time, in the 80s and 90s, they really reshaped the way the photo industry interacted with the talent. There was a time in the 60s and 70s when photographers would go and hang out, Bob Gruen and Jim Marshall and Annie Leibovitz, to name a couple of them, would really hang out with the band or ride on the bus or go on the plane and really get a lot of access. And publicists kind of started in the 80s to really squash that, and things became much more structured. And so portrait sittings then were scheduled to within, a time slot and a location where they needed to be. And it became a much more structured thing. So I was kind of at the tail end of that. So I was able to actually work with artists at length and also see that switch over to where it became kind of a more structured, sort of almost like corporate type environment. I know you had Matthew Sweet on your show. Yeah. And I worked with Matthew a couple times in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I guess. And we had a very similar thing where it was a very back and forth, a lot of time experimenting. It was really a great collaboration. And the level of collaboration, I feel like it's kind of related directly to the amount of time you're afforded and what the constraints are with the shoot. But I could give you an example of a shoot now could be something like, 1 hour for hair and makeup, 1 hour in front of the camera, 3 o'clock, Culver City, Smashbox, wherever, whatever studio we're going to shoot at. And there's a very structured thing. So, the idea is like to come up with the approach prior to the arrival. Everything's got to be in place. Hair and makeup are in place. Styling's in place. Now, that's not a new model by any means. I mean, when Penn would do settings, portrait sittings, a similar thing happened. Hair and makeup and styling would be there, and the sitter would come and arrive. But I think the level of collaboration, I think, is kind of it's sort of like in radio when they started doing playlists instead of letting DJs like do freeform radio. It just became a little bit more controlled.
I mean, you've photographed so many celebrities. Is there one that comes to mind that you just really enjoyed shooting for whatever reason that was?
Yeah, I think I've collaborated with several people that I really love to shoot. I love to shoot Tom Hanks and quite a bit. And I've photographed Sandra Bullock probably 30 or 40 times. But I think my favorite shoot, just holistically, from sort of start to finish, and the experience of it and the genuineness of it and the amount of time I was able to devote to it, which was considerable over a 3-day period, was when I photographed Mr. Rogers for Esquire. I was trepidatious going into it. I had no idea what I was in for. I wasn't one of the kids that was raised on Mr. Rogers. I grew up between Moore Park and Somas. We didn't have cable. He was on a PBS station. We couldn't get the PBS channel when I was a kid. So he wasn't a part of my childhood like so many people that I've shown that image to. My God, people have such an amazing reaction to it, or those images. But it was just the most genuine. And you know what it is too? A friend of mine, Courtney Valenti, she's president of a production at Warner Brothers. I had a conversation with her one time, and she said, I can always tell a lot about a person by how they treat their assistant. And, because they can put on a good face to me, but when they turn around and bark orders, I really can see sort of their sort of genuine self. And his assistants and people that were involved in his show over that 3-day period at any given time were coming up to me and just kind of pulling me aside and saying, I just want you to know I've worked for Fred for 22 years and I've never met a more amazing person. And this just repeated itself several times. And just the genuineness of him and the playfulness and the kindness, was amazing. And then I think the other thing was when I got home, and we still have this message, but when I got home, there was a message on the answering machine. My wife said, you got to listen to this. And it was a message from Fred, basically just saying, I hope you got home safe. And I hope Catherine and Dylan are okay. Like the idea that he remembered my wife's name and my son's name when he asked me one time what their names were, and he remembered it, or I don't know if he wrote it down, or it was kind of like, it was kind of a really special, amazing moment. And I really hold that one dear, that shoot of all the shoots. And I've done, many thousands of shoots in 35 years, but I think that's one that really stands out. There are quite a few, but that was kind of a really magical human shoot, I think, that stood out.
Hey, everybody, join the all new members area on my Before the Lights podcast website. The Salute Chin Chin package includes access to the Extra 5, shout out on a future show, some bonus content. The Zoom calls are going to be starting again soon. Also, we're going to have some rewards for you. Get the brand new limited edition poker chip. It looks absolutely fantastic. You're going to get 10% off all merch as well. Your name added to the show notes. To join for only $7.99 a month, go to beforethelightspod.com/support. That's beforethelightspod.com/support. Dan, to you, what makes a good portrait?
Well, the thing about, I talked earlier about establishing intent. And I think there isn't sort of a bad or a good, only because we all possess the full range of emotions that human beings, or most of us do anyway, that human beings are capable of expressing. And so, an over-the-top laughing portrait is just as valid as like a somber portrait. I tend to gravitate more in my own work to photographs that feel a little more introspective, that are gentle, that are disarming, that the viewer can connect to the subject. I think a big piece for me is like, this photograph, the intention of this image is for the person looking at the image to have some sort of connection with the person in the photograph. And I think that that's kind of what I strive for in my own work. But I mean, I've seen, I've made funny images, I've made, that work well in that genre. That's very difficult. Humor in photography is very difficult to do. You have to have the right subject to pull it off. But well, unless you're doing like really deadpan humor, then kind of anybody can do it. But I personally like, introspective, quiet portraiture personally. But and I also like the idea in a lot of my work, I like the idea of creating worlds where the viewer can look at the photograph and wonder where it was made and under what circumstances it was made, and wow, where is that place? A lot of times we'll build sets that are very sort of otherworldly, or sets that are of environments that are unique. And I like the idea that, and I get this a lot when I speak at schools, or if I lecture publicly, asking questions about like, where was that shot? Where was that? And a lot of times it was a set that we built, I designed, and we built the set. And that's a kind of satisfying piece. Penn did some different, he did this, they called it the pen, which it was kind of a corner of a room, and he'd kind of put people in there, and it was kind of an awkward environment to be in. And they're sort of trapped, and that was one way to go about kind of like causing some sort of tension. I did a portrait of Al Pacino for the New Yorker, and the only thing I wanted to talk to him about, he's got this huge career with all these incredible films, and I'm a huge fan of his, but I really was excited to ask him what it was like to be photographed by Irving Penn, because Penn photographed him 2 times, once early in his career and once later in his career before Penn passed away. And he told me the whole story of like, showing up at the studio and, getting right to work, and he said, just like we're doing right now. And so I was really excited to hear that story. I think that's the only person I've ever photographed that Penn also. No, I photographed Nicole Kidman. Penn had photographed her. There are probably several that have crossed over, but he was kind of like 1 and 2 generations and 3 generations before me. He was very much my senior when I started shooting. So I was not getting like the big A-list stuff, but. To answer your question about, I'm going to circle back to a question you asked earlier, which was a great question, and something just occurred to me, and that was that, how did I start getting portrait work, or how did that go? What was that process? So showing that portfolio of portraits, I started to get assigned portraits, and most of the portraits were people of some note in their field, or people of note in their field, but not people that were public, sort of on the consciousness of the public, or on the tip of their tongues. They were a little bit more obscure. And that went on for a while. And I really felt like I was generating really good work. And I loved the subjects I was getting, scientists and artists, painters, writers, other photographers. William Wegman I photographed. But there was one moment, like a defining moment in my career, where I got an assignment to photograph Denzel Washington for the New York Times Magazine. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And I talked to the stylist, and she brought the wardrobe by the studio a couple of days before so I could see it. And there was one specific kind of olive suit that she had pulled. And I was like, this is perfect. And so I built this environment by myself. I didn't even have an assistant on the job. I built this environment that was kind of this back room of like a juke joint in the South. I'd seen this book by Bernie Imes called Juke Joint, where he photographed all these different like juke joints. And I really liked the feel of this kind of like really like lived in environment. So I built this forced perspective set of him and put him in it and photographed him. And it was the first time I'd experienced one of those moments where the photograph ran on a Sunday in the Times Magazine. And on Monday, the phone was like, it wasn't ringing off the hook, but I was just started getting all these assignments because that was the first time that I had photographed what I would consider like an A-list, at least an A-list actor. I'd photographed other actors, but once again, this was coming out of when he did X, and he was, very well known. He had done Glory, and he was incredible in Glory, and he did X, and he was incredible in that, in Malcolm X. And so that was kind of the first time that I think, and you know what it is, what's funny to me, and I tell students this once again, I know I'm sort of ad infinitum talking about telling students things, but the idea of like passing on that experience is important to me. But the idea of, there's no bad assignments, there's only bad execution. And I think we have to have like a toolbox that is our own in case we need to revert to it. But I think if we lapse into formula, that can be, I think an artist stops growing if he lapses into formula. You talk about, the sophomore record is the hardest record for a lot of bands because, they want to grow, but the expectation is we want more of the same. We want more of the first record, and if you're a band like The Doors, your second record sounds pretty similar to your first record because most of that material was already written, and Morrison just wanted to evolve. And, so the record started to evolve. And, if you look at like probably people's lists of Doors records, like the first one's their number one record, their second one's the number two record, but bands struggle with the second record oftentimes. But I think oftentimes in retrospect, like Paul's Boutique by the Beastie Boys is considered like one of their best records, but it totally bombed because people wanted, their first record, the Hello Nasty. That's what they wanted. They wanted more of that. So the idea applies as well to photography and commercial photography specifically, is the idea that we saw that picture of Denzel. Can you make something like that for us? And that's frustrating because, of course, you did that and you want to move on beyond that. But there are ways to navigate that. There are ways to make a picture that's reminiscent of another picture that's not sort of self-plagiarism, and I think that's often been a challenge throughout a career. If you look at Penn's work, his entire body of work, he has several ways of working that are consistent over like, a 50-year period, and they're similar. Avedon did the same thing for his entire career. It's like one big umbrella, white background, open shade, white background, very, very similar. And the trick was then for both of them and myself is to, within that parameter that you set, get something that's compelling and that emotionally affects people. And I think that's your goal as a portrait photographer, to sort of affect people emotionally.
Dan, with everything you've done, and I can hear it in your voice and as you tell about your career, where does this thirst for your creativity come from?
It's a really good question. I think it's interesting, and I think it's unique to each individual. For myself, making things, drawing, from a very early age, creating, because ultimately what we're doing is we're taking the world and we're making stuff out of it, right? So I'm making photographs or drawings or films or books. So I'm like generating stuff. Now, you could look at it as like legacy, everybody's working on their legacy, the idea that I want to be remembered for something, what did I do of import? Am I significant? Is there any significance in what my pursuit has been? It's maybe more important to some people than others. For me, I've always loved the creative process, and this, my wife makes jokes about how I'm basically like 58, a 12-year-old who's in a 58-year-old body, because I'm basically doing the same thing I was doing and I see it myself. I see it, I go home and I have a model shop upstairs, and I go home and build models and like listen to music. And it's kind of exactly the same thing I was doing when I was in like 7th grade. And then doing photography, it's the same thing. Either I was taking pictures of my friends or now taking pictures of people of note, in luminaries in their fields, regardless of what the field is. And I think it's just a desire for me. Like, I don't think about it as like I need to create a legacy. Although it's more like I need to make another book. And I do understand, though, that those books are my legacy and are the legacy that we leave behind, like that body of work, because creating that work for periodicals or advertising, it only goes so far, right? So that magazine is gone after a couple of weeks. It's in someone's recycle bin, or it's in someone's, they used to joke about it being, when I worked at the newspaper, that it would be under a parakeet in 3 days. So don't worry about it, which I thought was kind of funny. But so the legacy there really is nothing that's tied to your legacy, because those are such short-term presentations of the work. So the idea of like putting it together cohesively, it also allows me to reflect on sort of what I've done wrong, what I would do differently, and try to learn from, those experiences. But I think that creative process, it certainly differs from person to person. I think, I have friends that are, neurosurgeons, and I've talked to them about their work, and, I draw a very similar connection when we speak about it. Passion, it's really like a physical manifestation of our passion is sort of what our work is, regardless if it's, what you're doing or what I'm doing, what my friends are doing. We're all trying to go through life expressing our passion. And I think ultimately that's probably what the creative process for me is the idea of like allowing my passion to sort of like manifest, and in a way that others can experience it.
Listeners, go to my show notes. You can go to his website, danwintersphoto.com. I'll put a link to that, as well as links to all of Dan's books. He has 3 of them. Dan Winter's periodical photographs. There's the last launch, the final launches of Discovery, Endeavor, and Atlantis, and Road to Seeing New Writers. So I'm going to put a link to all his books there in the show notes and his website. Dan, how long would it take you to put out all the images you've taken in your lifetime?
Well, there's actually 6 books.
There's 6.
Well, there's one that's very difficult to find. It was done in 1999, called Dan Winter's Photographs, but it pops up on eBay and Amazon periodically. That's a tough one. Road to Seeing. Then there's The Gray Ghost, is street photography in New York. And then there's a book called Dan Winter's America, Icons and Ingenuity. And that's kind of a survey. That was from a museum exhibition. That's sort of a survey of work over, maybe 25 years or something like that. So those are them. And then we have other ones we're working on now. But I don't know. I think I probably have, of material that I have now and material that I'm kind of developing, maybe like 5 more books, and then probably some like retrospective books. I think 1, 2, 3. We have 4 that we're working on actively right now. And there's a few other ones 5 we're working on actively, if I count the Permian Basin project. I need to go finish that, but I spent a bunch of time working on that one too. So it would take a while. Books take usually, you could do a book in a year. The idea of like editing it, laying it out, getting it press ready, having it printed, having it shipped. I usually say like about a year. You could do it a lot faster if you wanted to fast track it, but that's kind of so I don't know. It would take a while. Hopefully, I'll still be generating work, although my guess is that later in my life, most of the work will be kind of retrospective type work. Like I can't imagine that I'll be generating in my 80s, the amount of work that I can generate now in my 50s, and which is fine. That's just the nature. If you look at Penn's and Avedon's work later in life, their books they're survey books, which makes sense. They're kind of like, I did all this, I'm not doing this now, even though they both kept shooting right till the end.
You have over 100 awards. You have print and advertising and music clients. You have permanent collections, solo exhibitions. What are you most proud of your career?
In my career, with regards to imagery and regards to sort of affirmation, accolades, etc., probably World Press. That's a big honor to get a World Press. That's kind of like that's a big one. And I also got the Alfred Eisenstadt Award, which for magazine photography, which for me was huge because I was a huge fan and still am of Eisenstadt's work. And to get that award for magazine photography for me was, I think ultimately what all the awards are and is really kind of, if you look at them as like affirmation, like I'm on the right track. Like, okay, I'm on the right track. Like, I feel like I'm doing something right. I'm being acknowledged by my peers. I was talking to someone recently about, I was at a photo festival in Switzerland last month, and I was talking to another photographer, and, the topic came up about sort of like accolades. And I was like, the bottom line is no one knows who we are except for within our community. Like no one knows photographers. If you ask a person, a photographer, they'd say Annie Leibovitz or Richard Avedon, maybe. Most people across the country, if you went to Lincoln, Nebraska and ask someone to name a photographer, they wouldn't be able to name one photographer probably. So it's not like we know, and I'm not saying there's a lack of intelligence. There's just, and if you were in New York, people could name a lot. It just depends, but I don't think, many photographers have ever made it to like household name status. And so we take the accolades and recognition lightly, but also knowing that within our industry and from our peers, the acknowledgement is, it's significant and not to be sort of taken for granted, I suppose.
I said in the intro that you are also a beekeeper and have beehives in the backyard of your studio. When did this love for beehives start and how long have you been doing it?
So I was in 4-H, which is 4-H is a club for, I don't know if people don't know what 4-H is anymore. It's a club that was started in 1911 by the Department of Agriculture. It's a government program. And the idea initially was it acted as like a vocational school for rural America when we were more agrarian. The idea of teaching trades to kids so that they would have something they could, make a living off of. So it encompasses a pretty broad range of disciplines, and it's really bolstered by the people in the community that are actually the leaders. And so in any given community, so mine was Moore Park, or actually Homeacres, 4-H. Within that community, we had a photography instructor who was my friend's dad, who I talked about. We had a beekeeping instructor. His name was Richard Ron. He was a commercial beekeeper, and he volunteered to teach a beekeeping project. There were only like 3 kids in it or 4 kids in it. But, I bought my first beehive off of him when I was 9 years old. And by the time I was in high school, I had 36 hives, and I was selling honey. And I really, I studied entomology as well for many, many years. So I started when I was 9 in entomology until I was 18. So 9 years. And really always connected with insects and the insect world and really love insects. And beekeeping is kind of a great extension of that because it's kind of the only domesticated discipline with insects is beekeeping. So when I was 9, I sold my hives when I went to college, and I started back up about 8 or 9 years ago. I got a couple hives. Now I have 3. We just harvested 27 pounds of honey, and I'll do a little bit more harvesting right before winter because I left them a lot. And I'll go see what they produced. It's been a really wet year, which is really good for honey, really good for honey production. So yeah, it started as when I was a kid. Like I said, it's like pretty much do all the same stuff I did when I was a kid. There's a photographer called Jay Maisel who I love, and I know Jay for many years. He's in his 80s now. But he said something once that I thought was really amazing. And I share this oftentimes when I speak to audiences and students. And he said, if you want to make better photographs, become a more interesting person. And I think that's a really great, like how diverse is your ability at conversation? How curious are you? All those things will fuel your artistic endeavors. So I think that's like probably the most sage advice I could give any photographer.
Dan, I just want to say it's been an honor to have you on my show. This has been just fantastic to listen to your passion for your career and what you've done. You're an icon in the industry in my eyes, and I just want to say thank you for being on the show.
Sure, I'm honored to be on the show. Thank you.
Listeners, if you'd like to donate to the podcast, go to beforethelightspod.com/donate. That's beforethelightspod.com/donate. Follow us on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.